I stood at the back of my own funeral, watching my son Daniel glance at his watch. My daughter-in-law Melissa whispering, "I told you." She didn't really have anyone. The room was nearly empty, just a few polite faces and forced condolences. 68 years of my life reduced to silence. Then the doors opened. One person walked in, then another, and another. Within minutes, the hallway filled. Strangers, no, not strangers, people whose eyes carried grief deeper than my own family's. Daniel's face turned pale, because the woman they thought had no friends had filled an entire hall with people who owed her their lives. If this story touches you in any way, take a moment to like and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I'd really love to know who's here with me. People always assume silence means emptiness. In my house, silence meant something very different. It meant I had learned over the years that speaking up only made things worse. My name is Erica Hughes. I was 68 years old, a widow for nearly 15 years, and according to my own son, just there. That was the phrase Daniel used one evening when he thought I couldn't hear him. "She's not doing anything, Mel," he said from the kitchen, his voice low, but not low enough. "She's just there. Just there." I remember standing in the hallway, my hand resting on the wall for support, staring at the family photos we had hung years ago. There was one of Daniel as a little boy, missing his front teeth, grinning up at me like I was the center of his universe. Funny how things change. I lived in their house, though technically it had once been mine. After my husband passed, Daniel had convinced me to transfer the title. "It's just easier, Mom," he'd said. "For taxes, for paperwork. I'll take care of everything." I believed him. Of course I did. He was my son. Now I occupied the small guest bedroom at the end of the hallway. It used to be Daniel's childhood room. The wallpaper had changed, the furniture had changed, but sometimes late at night, I could still picture the little boy who used to run in and hug me after a nightmare. Those memories were quieter now. Fainter. Did she even have any friends? Melissa's voice cut through my thoughts that same night. She didn't bother lowering her tone the way Daniel did. "I don't think so," Daniel replied. "She never talks about anyone." "Well, that's going to be awkward," Melissa said with a short laugh. "I mean, if something ever happens, who's even going to show up?" I remember pressing my lips together, forcing myself not to react, not to step into the kitchen and remind them that I was still alive, that I could hear every word. Instead, I turned and walked back into my room, closing the door softly behind me. Because what would I say? That I did have friends, that I had a life outside those walls. They wouldn't believe me. Not because it wasn't true, but because they had already decided who I was. To them, I was the quiet old woman who stayed out of the way, who didn't work, who didn't contribute, who didn't seem to exist beyond the edges of their busy lives. They never noticed the small things. They never noticed that every morning I left the house before anyone else was awake. I would put on my coat, the same beige one I'd worn for years, and pick up the worn leather bag I kept by the door. The zipper stuck sometimes, and I had to tug it twice to close it properly. Inside that bag were things they had never bothered to ask about. Documents, letters, a notebook filled with names. Names that meant nothing to my family, but everything to me. I would step outside into the early morning air, the kind that still held a chill even in late spring. The neighborhood would be quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. And for a few precious hours each day, I wasn't just there. I was needed. I would walk to the bus stop at the corner, nodding politely to the driver, who had memorized my routine long before anyone in my own home noticed it. "Morning, Ms. Hughes," he'd say with a warm smile. "Good morning," I'd reply. Simple words, but they carried more recognition than anything I heard inside my house. Some days, I went to a small community center downtown. The building wasn't much to look at: faded paint, creaky floors, but inside, it was full of life. Other days, I visited the hospital. Not as a patient, never as a patient. I moved quietly through the halls, stopping at rooms where people had no one else to sit with them. Sometimes I held a hand. Sometimes I listened. Sometimes I just sat in silence because that's all someone needed. And sometimes I did more. But those are details my family never cared to know. One afternoon, as I was leaving the house, I felt a pair of eyes on me. I turned slightly and saw Chloe, my granddaughter, standing halfway down the stairs. She was 16, always with her phone in hand, always half distracted. "Where do you go every day?" she asked, not unkindly, just curious. I smiled at her. "Oh, just out," I said. She frowned a little, as if she expected more. But when I didn't offer anything else, she shrugged and went back to her screen. That was the closest anyone had come to asking. And even then, they didn't really want the answer. It became easier over time to let them believe what they wanted. That I had no friends. That I had no purpose. That my world was as small as that guest bedroom. The truth was, my world was bigger than they could imagine. But it wasn't a truth I felt the need to defend. Because I had learned something important a long time ago. Not all lives are meant to be understood by the people closest to them. Some are meant to be lived quietly in places where no one is watching. Still, there were moments when the loneliness crept in. Like at dinner, we would sit around the table, Daniel, Melissa, Chloe, and me, and the conversation would flow around me like I wasn't even there. Work, school, friends, plans. No one asked about my day. No one wondered where I had been. And after a while, I stopped expecting them to. I would eat slowly, listening, nodding, when appropriate, smiling, when someone glanced in my direction out of politeness. Then I would clear my plate, wash it, and return to my room. Routine, predictable, invisible. One night, Melissa set her fork down with a sigh. "We really need to talk about the space situation," she said. Daniel looked at her, then briefly at me before looking away again. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, we can't keep living like this," she said. "Chloe's getting older. She needs her own space. And your mom?" She paused as if searching for the right word. "She might be happier somewhere else." Somewhere else. The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Daniel didn't respond right away. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought he might defend me. But then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe it's time we start looking into options." Options. That was the night I realized something with absolute clarity. In my own home, I was already gone. They just hadn't made it official yet, so I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet. I finished my meal. I washed my plate. And the next morning, before the sun came up, I picked up my worn leather bag and stepped out into a world where I still mattered. The strange thing about being underestimated is that people stop being careful around you. They say things they shouldn't. They reveal what they truly think. And sometimes they make decisions right in front of you as if you're already gone. That night, I wasn't supposed to hear them again. I had gone to bed early, or at least that's what they assumed. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying Melissa's words, somewhere else, over and over again. So I got up. The house was dimly lit, the only light coming from the kitchen. I moved slowly, my slippers silent against the hardwood floor, stopping just before the corner where I could hear their voices clearly. "You know we can't keep putting this off," Melissa said, her tone sharper than usual. "I've already looked into a few places. Places. Not homes, not communities. Places." Daniel sighed. "I know. I don't want it to feel like we're abandoning her." Melissa let out a short laugh. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. "Daniel, come on. She barely talks to us. She doesn't go anywhere except God knows where every day. It's not like she has some big social life we're interrupting." I closed my eyes. There it was again. That assumption. "She'll probably be better off," Melissa continued. "Around people her own age, activities, meals, nurses. Honestly, it's more than we can give her." Daniel didn't answer right away, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself a fragile hope. Maybe he would say no. Maybe he would remember the woman who raised him. The nights I stayed up when he was sick. The second job I took when his father lost his. The years I gave without ever keeping count. But hope, I've learned, can be a dangerous thing. "Yeah," Daniel finally said. "You're probably right. Probably right." That was all it took. No argument, no hesitation strong enough to matter. Just acceptance. I felt something inside me shift. Not break, no, that had happened a long time ago. This was quieter than that. This was clarity. I stepped back before they could see me retreating down the hallway, my hand brushing against the wall again for balance. It wasn't anger I felt, not even sadness. It was something heavier. Final. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands. They looked older than I remembered. Thin veins visible beneath the skin, the faint tremor that had started a few years ago. These hands had held so many things. A newborn baby, a frightened teenager, a stranger's hand in a hospital room. But to my own family, they were just the hands of someone who had nothing left to give. I let out a slow breath. "They don't know," I whispered to myself. And it was true. They didn't know where I went. They didn't know what I did. They didn't know the names written in my notebook or the stories behind each one. And maybe that was my fault. I had never told them, never explained, never defended myself. But then again, they had never asked. The next morning, I followed my routine as if nothing had changed. I woke before dawn, dressed quietly, and picked up my bag. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something new. A brochure sitting on the kitchen counter. I didn't need to pick it up to know what it was. But I did anyway. Sunnyvale Senior Living, smiling faces on the cover. Perfect lighting. Promises of comfort, care, and community. I traced the edge of the paper with my finger. This was how it would happen then. Not with a conversation. Not with honesty. With a brochure left out in the open as if I would simply understand. As if I would agree. I set it back down exactly where it had been and walked out the front door. The air was colder than usual that morning. Or maybe it just felt that way. At the bus stop, the driver greeted me like always. "Morning, Ms. Hughes." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Good morning." He didn't notice anything different. Neither did the people at the community center when I arrived. "Erica," a voice called out as soon as I stepped inside. It was Mrs. Patterson sitting in her usual chair near the window. "You're late today," she teased. I smiled, setting my bag down beside her. "Only by a few minutes." "Well, those minutes matter," she said, wagging a finger playfully. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about us." Forgotten. The word lingered in my mind. "I wouldn't do that," I said softly, and I meant it. Here I wasn't invisible. Here I was Erica, not someone's burden, not someone's obligation. Just Erica. I spent the morning the way I always did, listening, helping, organizing small things that made a big difference to people who had very little. At one point, a young man approached me hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, "are you Erica Hughes?" I looked up at him, recognizing his face immediately. "Marcus," I said, smiling. "It's been a while." His shoulders relaxed instantly. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," he admitted. "I remember everyone," I said, and it was true. Every name in that notebook, every story, every moment that had mattered. Marcus shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. I wanted to say thank you again. Every name in that notebook, every story, every moment that had mattered." Marcus shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. I wanted to say thank you again," he said. "I wouldn't be where I am today without you." I felt a familiar warmth in my chest. "You did the work I told him." "I just helped a little." He smiled, but there was something emotional behind it. "Well, that little help changed everything." As he walked away, I watched him for a moment. This was my life. This was my world. And yet the people I lived with had no idea it existed. On the bus ride home that afternoon, I stared out the window, watching the city blur past. I thought about the brochure on the counter, about Daniel's quiet agreement, about Melissa's certainty. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe they were right about one thing. Maybe I didn't belong in that house anymore, but not for the reasons they believed. When I got home, the brochure was gone. In its place was something else, a sticky note written in Melissa's neat handwriting. "We'll talk tonight." I stood there for a long moment, staring at those 3 words. Then I nodded to myself. "Yes," I whispered. "Tonight." Because whether they realized it or not, that conversation was going to change everything. That evening, the house felt different. Not louder, not more tense, just decided. You can feel it when people have already made up their minds about you. There's a certain finality in the air, like a door that's already been closed. You just haven't heard the click yet. I sat at the dinner table like I always did, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my posture straight out of habit rather than comfort. Daniel avoided looking at me. Melissa didn't. She watched me the way someone studies a problem they're about to solve. Chloe was the only one who seemed unsure, her eyes flickering between her parents and me, sensing something, but not quite understanding it. We ate in near silence, forks against plates, glasses set down, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background. Then Melissa cleared her throat. "Erica," she said. It was the first time she had used my name in weeks. I looked up. "Yes?" She glanced at Daniel as if passing him the responsibility, but when he didn't speak, she continued. "We think it's time to have an honest conversation." "Honest." I almost smiled at the word. "I agree," I said softly. That seemed to catch her off guard. Daniel shifted in his seat. "Mom, we've been thinking about what's best for everyone." There it was again. Not what was best for me, for everyone. "I understand," I said. Melissa leaned forward slightly, her tone taking on that careful, measured quality people use when they think they're being kind. "We've been looking into some senior living communities," she said. "Places where you'd have more support, more social opportunities." Her voice faded slightly as she continued listing the benefits, activities, healthcare, companionship, as if reading from that brochure I had seen that morning. I listened, really listened, not just to her words, but to what was underneath them. Relief, convenience, distance. And we think Daniel added quickly that it might be a really good change for you. A change. I nodded slowly. And when were you planning to tell me? I asked. The question landed heavier than I intended. Melissa blinked. We're telling you now? No, I said, gently. You decided before now. Silence. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. We just didn't want to upset you. I let that settle between us. Then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in my chest all day. Do you believe I have no one? Melissa frowned slightly. What do you mean? I said, keeping my voice steady. Do you believe keeping my voice steady? Do you believe that if I left this house, no one would notice? Daniel hesitated. Melissa didn't. Well, you don't really have friends, Erica, she said. At least not that we've ever seen. Not that we've ever seen. I nodded again. That's true that if I left this house, no one would notice? Daniel hesitated. Melissa didn't. Well, you don't really have friends, Erica, she said. At least not that we've ever seen. Not that we've ever seen. I nodded again. That's true, I said, because in their world, it was. Chloe spoke up, then her voice small, but clear. Grandma goes out every day, she said. Maybe she… Chloe, Melissa interrupted gently. Your grandma just goes for walks. I looked at my granddaughter, meeting her eyes for a moment. She looked back at me, uncertainty written all over her face. I could have said something then. I could have told them everything, about the community center, about the hospital, about the people whose lives had crossed mine in ways my family had never bothered to imagine. But I didn't. Instead, I asked another question. Have you ever wondered where I go? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Melissa shrugged. We assumed you just kept to yourself. Assumed. That word again. I see, I said. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just acknowledgement. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Mom, this isn't about that. This is about making sure you're taken care of. We can't always be here, and you've never been here, I said quietly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. The room went still. Daniel stared at me, surprised. Melissa's expression tightened. I don't mean physically, I added, my voice softer now. You live in the same house. I understand that. No one spoke. I mean, you've never really seen me. That hit harder. I could tell. Daniel looked down at the table. Melissa crossed her arms, defensive now. That's not fair, she said. We've given you a place to live. We make sure you have everything you need. I have everything I need, I said. And for the first time, I let a little more truth into my voice. Just not here. Silence again. Chloe shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable. Daniel finally spoke. Mom, what are you saying? I took a breath. This was the moment, the point where everything could change. I'm saying, I replied, that if you believe I have no life outside of this house, then you've been wrong for a very long time. Melissa let out a small, incredulous laugh. Okay, she said, then tell us, where do you go every day? There was a challenge in her tone now, a disbelief she wasn't even trying to hide. I looked at her, then at Daniel, then at Chloe. 3 faces, 3 different versions of expectation. And for a brief second, I considered giving them the answer, the full answer. But something stopped me. Not fear, not hesitation. Something else. Understanding. Because the truth is, some realizations don't come from being told. They come from being faced. You'll find out, I said simply. Melissa's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me, I said. I repeated calmly. You'll find out. Daniel frowned. Mom, this isn't a game? No, I agreed. It isn't. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin beside my plate. But I think, I added, it's time you saw things for yourselves. Melissa shook her head, clearly frustrated. We're trying to have a serious conversation here? So am I said. And this time, there was no softness left in my voice. Just quiet certainty. I picked up my plate and walked to the sink, rinsing it as I always did. Routine. Familiar. But something had shifted. Behind me, I could feel their confusion, their irritation, their discomfort. Good, because for the first time in a very long while, they were paying attention. As I dried my hands, I glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:17 p.m. Plenty of time. Erica Daniels said, his voice more urgent now. We need to figure this out. I turned back to face him. No, I said gently. You need to understand it. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Tomorrow, I added, reaching for my bag and setting it by the door for the morning. Just watch. Melissa scoffed under her breath. Watch what I met her eyes. And for the first time, I let them see something they had never seen before. Confidence. You'll see, I said. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hallway to my room, leaving them in the dark, both literally and in every other way that mattered. Because tomorrow, everything they thought they knew about me was about to fall apart. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, not because I had somewhere new to be, but because something inside me had already shifted. There are days when life quietly turns a corner and you don't even realize it until you're already walking a different path. This was one of those days. I sat on the edge of my bed for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The house was still asleep. Daniel's door was closed. Melissa's alarm hadn't gone off yet. Chloe's room was dark. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was sneaking out. I felt certain. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a sweater I hadn't worn in a while. It was simple navy blue, soft at the sleeves, but it made me feel like myself. Like the version of me that existed outside those walls. I picked up my worn leather bag, checking its contents out of habit. The notebook. The letters. The small envelope I had added the night before. Everything was in place. As I stepped into the hallway, I paused for just a second, glancing toward the kitchen. The brochure wasn't there anymore, but its presence lingered. I walked out without a sound. The air outside felt sharper, colder against my skin, but I welcomed it. It kept me awake, focused. At the bus stop, the driver gave me his usual smile. Morning, Ms. Hughes. Good morning, I replied. But this time, I held his gaze a little longer, because today wasn't routine. Today mattered. The ride downtown felt shorter than usual. Or maybe my mind was just too busy to notice the time passing. I watched the city come alive through the window, people rushing to work, storefronts opening, the quiet rhythm of a world that never really stops. And somewhere in the middle of all that movement was me. A woman my own family thought had nowhere to be. When I stepped off the bus, I didn't head toward the community center right away. Instead, I walked a few blocks farther, toward the hospital. The automatic doors slid open as I approached, and the familiar scent of antiseptic and quiet urgency greeted me. Hospitals have a way of humbling you. Everyone there is either holding on or letting go. I moved through the halls with purpose, nodding at a nurse who recognized me. Good morning, Erica, she said warmly. Good morning, Linda, I replied. She glanced at the clock. "You're early today. I have a few things to take care of," I said. She smiled, not questioning it. People here never questioned me. They didn't need explanations. They understood something my family never had. That presence matters. I made my way to the third floor, stopping outside a room where the door was slightly ajar. Inside, an older man lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were searching for something. I knocked gently. "Mr. Carter?" I said. He turned his head slowly, his expression softening when he saw me. "Well, if it isn't my favorite visitor," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I stepped inside, pulling a chair closer to his bed. "How are you feeling today?" I asked. He shrugged. "Same as yesterday. Maybe a little more tired." I nodded. We both knew what that meant. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "You're not alone," I said quietly. He squeezed my hand weakly. "Never am when you're around," he replied. We sat like that for a while, talking about small things, weather memories, stories that didn't need to be extraordinary to matter. This was what I did. This was where I belonged. Before I left, I adjusted his blanket, making sure he was comfortable. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked. I hesitated. Just for a second. Then I smiled. "Of course," I said, but something inside me whispered, "Maybe not the way you think." As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt a wave of dizziness hit me. It wasn't sudden enough to scare me, but it wasn't normal either. I paused, placing a hand against the wall for support. Erica Linda's voice called from down the hall. I straightened slightly. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. She walked over, her expression concerned. "You don't look fine," she said. "Have you eaten?" "I will," I replied. That was always my answer. I had spent so many years making sure other people were taken care of that I had learned to ignore the small signals my own body sent. Linda studied me for a moment, then sighed. "Just sit down for a minute," she said. "I don't have time," I answered softly. And it was true. Not today. Not anymore. She didn't argue, but I could see the worry in her eyes as I walked away. I left the hospital and made my way to the community center, the familiar building coming into view like a quiet refuge. Inside, the usual sounds greeted me. Voices, laughter, the clatter of chairs. "Erica," Mrs. Patterson called again, waving me over. I smiled, but something felt different, heavier, like the air itself had changed. As I sat down beside her, she leaned in slightly. "You look tired today," she said. "Just a long morning," I replied. She patted my hand. "Well, don't you go overdoing it. We need you around here." Need. There it was again. A word that carried more weight than most people realized. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. But even as I spoke, I wasn't entirely sure it was true. The dizziness came back later, stronger this time. The room tilted slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "Erica," someone said, their voice distant. I tried to answer, tried to smile, tried to reassure them. But the world around me began to blur, the edges softening, the sounds fading. And in that moment, one thought rose above everything else. Not fear, not regret, just clarity. They're about to find out. The last thing I remember was the sound of my bag hitting the floor, and the notebook inside it sliding out, pages spilling open to names my family had never seen. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, everything was quiet. Not the familiar quiet of early mornings or empty rooms, but something deeper. A stillness that felt detached, like the world had stepped back just slightly beyond my reach. For a moment, I didn't understand where I was. Then I saw the ceiling. White, flat, unfamiliar. A hospital, but not the way I remembered it. I wasn't lying in a bed. I was standing. That realization came slowly, like a ripple through still water. I looked down at my hand, steady now, no tremor, and then around the room. There was a body in the bed. My body. Erica Hughes, 68 years old. Still. Too still. Linda stood beside the bed, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wet. No, Erica, she whispered. A doctor spoke quietly behind her, his voice low, professional. We did everything we could. I felt no pain, no fear, just awareness. And then slowly, something else. Understanding. The next moment shifted like a page turning. I was no longer in the hospital room. I was standing in a place I recognized instantly. The funeral home. Soft lighting, rows of chairs, the faint scent of polished wood and flowers. Time had moved forward. Days, maybe. I didn't question how or why. I just knew. At the front of the room was my casket, closed. Simple, unremarkable. Just the way Melissa would have chosen it. I turned slightly, taking in the room. And there they were. Daniel stood near the front, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He wore a dark suit that didn't quite fit right, as if he hadn't expected to need it so soon. Melissa stood beside him, her arms crossed lightly, her face composed but distant. Chloe sat in the front row. Her head lowered, her phone absent from her hands for once. A few other people were scattered around the room. Neighbors, distant relatives, the kind of people who show up out of obligation, not connection. The room felt empty. And then Melissa leaned toward Daniel, her voice low but clear enough for me to hear. I told you, she said softly. There's barely anyone. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just looked around the room, his eyes scanning the empty seats. I guess she really didn't have anyone, he said. The words landed with a strange weight. Not painful, not anymore, just wrong. Chloe shifted in her seat. That's not true, she murmured. Melissa glanced at her. Honey, we never saw her with anyone. Chloe hesitated. But she went out every day. Daniel sighed. Yeah, but that doesn't mean... The sound of the door opening cut him off. All three of them turned. A man stepped inside. Mid-50s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a neatly pressed suit. His expression was serious, his eyes scanning the room with purpose. He wasn't family. That much was clear immediately. He walked slowly toward the front, his gaze settling on the casket. For a moment, he just stood there. Then he removed his hat, holding it against his chest. I'm here for Erica Hughes, he said quietly. Daniel blinked, confused. Yes. This is her service. The man nodded once. My name is James Carter, he said. I was told she passed. Melissa stepped forward slightly, her polite smile returning. Yes, she did, she said. I'm her daughter-in-law. James looked at her, then at Daniel. And you're her family? He asked. Daniel straightened. Yes, I'm her son. There was a pause, a subtle one, but I felt it. James studied Daniel's face for a second longer than expected. Then he nodded again. I see, he said. He turned back toward the casket, his expression softening. I just wanted to say goodbye, he added. Melissa gestured toward the seating area. Of course, please have a seat. But James didn't sit. Instead, he stepped closer to the casket, placing his hand gently on its surface. She saved my life, he said. The room went still. Daniel frowned slightly. I'm sorry. What? James didn't look at him. 3 years ago. He continued, his voice steady. I was ready to end everything. Melissa's smile faded. Chloe looked up, her eyes widening. I had lost my job. My family was gone. I had nothing left, James said. And then she found me. Daniel shook his head slightly. I think you might have the wrong person. I don't, James said firmly, finally turning to face him. His eyes were clear. Certain. Erica Hughes, he repeated. She sat with me for hours, talked me through things I didn't even understand about myself, made sure I got help. He paused, his voice tightening just slightly. She didn't know me. She didn't have to care. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. But she did. He finished. Melissa glanced at Daniel, confusion written all over her face. Daniel looked back at James, unsure. I didn't know that, he said. James nodded slowly. No, he replied. I don't think you did. The words weren't harsh, but they carried something sharper than anger. Truth. Chloe leaned forward slightly. You mean my grandma helped you? James' expression softened when he looked at her. Your grandmother helped a lot of people, he said. A quiet tension filled the room. Daniel shifted his weight. Well, I'm glad she, made a difference. It sounded awkward, distant, like he was talking about someone he didn't quite recognize. James noticed. Of course he did. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. She gave me this, he said, holding it up. Told me to keep it for when I needed to remember. He unfolded it carefully. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. He read, his voice steady. But I know you're stronger than today makes you feel. Chloe's eyes filled with tears. Melissa looked away. Daniel stared at the floor. That's her handwriting, Chloe whispered. And just like that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough. Enough for doubt to creep in. Enough for the first crack to form in the story they had told themselves about me. James folded the paper again, slipping it back into his pocket. I wouldn't be here without her, he said simply. Then he stepped back. And for the first time since the service began, the room didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was waiting. Waiting for something. Or someone. And as the door opened again behind him, I knew exactly what that something was. The door didn't just open. It stayed open. And that made all the difference. At first, it was just one more person. A woman in her early 40s stepped inside, clutching a small bouquet of white flowers. Her eyes were already red, as if she had been crying long before she arrived. She paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room the same way James had. Then she spotted the casket. Her hand flew to her mouth. Oh no, she whispered. Chloe turned slightly, watching her. Melissa straightened her polite expression, returning out of habit. Can we help you? She asked. The woman nodded quickly, stepping forward. Yes, I'm here for Erica Hughes. Daniel glanced at Melissa, confusion flickering across his face again. Yes, this is her service, he said. The woman moved closer, her steps hesitant but determined. My name is Linda Brooks, she said, her voice trembling. I work at Mercy General Hospital. I felt a quiet recognition ripple through me. Linda, of course. She stopped beside James, who gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. You knew her? Daniel asked. Linda let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh through her tears. Knew her, she repeated. She practically lived at that hospital. Melissa's composure cracked for just a second. I'm sorry you knew her, Daniel asked. Linda let out a soft, almost disbelieving laugh through her tears. Knew her, she repeated. She practically lived at that hospital. Melissa's composure cracked for just a second. I'm sorry what she said. Linda looked at her surprised. You didn't know she asked. No one answered. Linda's expression shifted, confusion turning slowly into something else. Realization. She volunteered there almost every day, Linda continued. She sat with patients who had no family. She stayed through the nights when no one else would. Chloe's eyes widened. Daniel shook his head slightly as if trying to process what he was hearing. That doesn't sound right, Melissa said, her tone defensive again. Erica, she did? Linda interrupted gently but firmly. There was no anger in her voice, just certainty. I've been a nurse for over 15 years, she added. I've seen a lot of people come and go. But your mother? She looked at Daniel, her gaze steady. She was different. I've been a nurse for over 15 years, she added. I've seen a lot of people come and go. But your mother? She looked at Diane go. But your mother? She looked at Daniel, her gaze steady. She was different. Daniel swallowed. How he asked quietly. Linda glanced at the casket, her eyes softening. She didn't just visit, she said. She remembered people, their names, their stories, their fears. Neil, her gaze steady, she was different. Daniel swallowed. How he asked quietly. Linda glanced at the casket, her eyes softening. She didn't just visit, she said. She remembered people, their names, their stories, their fears. She paused, her voice catching slightly. She held hands when families couldn't. She made sure no one died alone. The words settled into the room like something sacred, heavy, unavoidable. Melissa looked away, her arms tightening across her chest. That's not something she ever told us, she said. Linda nodded slowly. She wouldn't, she replied. She never did it for recognition. Chloe leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw her once, she said. Talking to someone outside, I thought it was just... She trailed off. Just what? Just nothing. Just her grandmother being invisible. James spoke again, then his voice quieter this time. She helped me find a reason to keep going, he said. Linda nodded. And she did that for more people than you realize. As if on cue, the door opened again. This time, 2 people entered. A young man in his 20s, dressed neatly but nervously adjusting his tie. And beside him, an older woman, her arm linked through his. They hesitated when they saw the room. The casket. The small group gathered at the front. Is this? The young man began. Yes, Daniel said automatically. This is Erica Hughes' service. The young man exhaled relief and grief, mixing in his expression. Thank God we made it, he said softly. He stepped forward, guiding the older woman beside him. My name is Marcus Hill, he said, And this is my mother. Linda smiled faintly at the name. Of course she recognized him too. You knew, Erica Melissa asked, her voice now less confident. Marcus let out a small, disbelieving laugh. Knew her, he echoed just like Linda had. He shook his head, his eyes already shining. She paid for my college, he said. The room went completely still. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry she did what? Marcus nodded, emotion rising in his voice. I was about to drop out, he explained. Couldn't afford tuition. My mom was working 2 jobs and it still wasn't enough. His mother squeezed his arm gently. And then she showed up, Marcus continued. Said she'd heard about my situation through the community center. Asked me one question. What question? Chloe asked. Marcus smiled faintly. If money wasn't a problem, would you finish Chloe's breath caught? And I said yes, Marcus said. So she said, then let's not make it the problem. He looked at the casket, his voice breaking. She didn't just help me once, he added. She checked in, made sure I stayed on track, made sure I didn't give up. Daniel stared at him speechless. Melissa shook her head slowly as if trying to reject the reality unfolding in front of her. That's not possible, she said under her breath. But it was, and they were starting to see it. Marcus's mother stepped forward, then her voice soft, but filled with emotion. She saved my son's future, she said, and she never asked for anything in return. The room felt different now. Fuller, heavier, alive with stories that had never been told. And still, the door remained open. Another person entered, then another, a teacher, a former patient, a woman with a child holding her hand. Each one carrying a piece of a life my family had never seen. Each one stepping forward with the same quiet certainty. They were there for me. Melissa's composure began to unravel. This doesn't make any sense, she whispered to Daniel. But it did, perfectly. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time, he was seeing me, not the version he had reduced to silence, not the woman who was just there, but the one who had been everywhere else. Chloe stood up slowly, her eyes moving from face to face. How many people, she murmured. No one answered, because no one knew. Not yet. But as more footsteps echoed in the hallway, and more voices filled the space, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a truth, too big to ignore, and it was only just beginning to reveal itself. The doors didn't stop opening. At first, Daniel kept glancing back every time he heard the soft creak. Each time his expression shifted confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to unease. Because it wasn't just 1 or 2 more people. It was a steady stream. A middle-aged teacher carrying a worn folder. A young mother holding a child's hand tightly. An older man walking with a cane, his steps slow but determined. Each one entered with the same look. Recognition, loss, respect. And none of them looked at Daniel or Melissa. They looked at the casket. They looked at me. The room began to fill. Not loudly, not chaotically, but undeniably. Seats that had been empty just minutes ago were now occupied. The quiet space that once echoed with absence now held murmurs, low voices shared stories, soft greetings between people who had clearly crossed paths before. Melissa stood frozen near the front, her arms no longer crossed, but hanging awkwardly at her sides. This isn't normal, she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because he was watching something he couldn't explain. Chloe, however, had moved. She stood now beside James and Linda, her eyes wide as she listened to the conversations forming around her. "She helped my sister," someone said behind her. "She stayed with my father the whole night." She stood now beside James and Linda, her eyes wide as she listened to the conversations forming around her. "She helped my sister," someone said behind her. "She stayed with my father the whole night," another voice added. "She paid my rent when I had nowhere else to go. She talked me out of something I can't even say out loud." Each sentence landed like a drop of water, slowly filling a space that had once been empty. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his composure beginning to crack. "Melissa," he said quietly. "How many people did she know?" Melissa shook her head, her voice tight. "I don't know," she said. "I didn't even know she knew anyone." But now, it was impossible to deny. Because the evidence was standing right in front of them. Person after person, story after story. And then the room reached its limit. A funeral home attendant stepped forward, quietly speaking to Daniel in a low voice. "We may need to open the overflow room," he said. Daniel blinked. "The what?" "There are more people outside," the attendant explained. "We're running out of seats. We may need to open the overflow room," he said. Daniel blinked. "The what?" "There are more people outside," the attendant explained. "We're running out of seats." Melissa's head snapped toward the door. "More," she repeated. The attendant nodded. "Yes, ma'am." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Chloe moved. "I'm going to see," she said softly. Daniel didn't stop her. He couldn't, because part of him already knew what she would find. Chloe walked toward the entrance, her steps slow at first, then faster. When she reached the doors, she pushed them open and stopped. Outside was a line. Not a short one. Not a handful of people waiting politely. A line that stretched down the hallway. People standing quietly, patiently, holding flowers, envelopes, photographs. Waiting for their turn. Chloe's breath caught. "Oh my God," she whispered. The people nearest the front noticed her. "Is this Erica Hughes' service?" one woman asked gently. Chloe nodded, her voice barely steady. "Yes, it is." The woman smiled softly. "Good," she said. "We've been waiting. Waiting. Not wondering if they should come. Not debating whether it mattered. Just waiting." Chloe stepped back slowly, her mind racing. She turned and walked back into the room, her expression completely changed. Daniel saw it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Chloe looked at him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Not confusion, not curiosity, understanding. There's a line," she said. Melissa frowned. "A line for what?" "For Grandma," Chloe replied. The words hit harder than anything else had. Daniel stared at her. "How many?" he asked. Chloe shook her head slowly. "I don't know," she admitted. "A lot." The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of realization. Melissa took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the nearest chair. "That's not possible," she murmured. But it was. Every second made it more real, more undeniable. James glanced toward the door, then back at Daniel. "You should let them in," he said quietly. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. The attendant moved quickly, opening the side doors, guiding people into the overflow space, adjusting the flow so everyone could pass through respectfully. And they came, one by one, dozens, then more. Some stayed only a moment, placing flowers near the casket before stepping aside. Others lingered, sharing brief words, quiet memories. A few approached Daniel directly. "Thank you for sharing her with us," one woman said. Daniel blinked. I didn't, but she had already moved on. Another man stepped forward. "She helped my brother when no one else would," he said. "I just wanted you to know that." Daniel nodded slowly, unable to form a response. Melissa watched it all, her expression no longer defensive, but shaken. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a single story taken out of context. This was a pattern, a life, a truth they had never seen. Chloe moved closer to the casket, her hand resting lightly on its surface. "You didn't tell us," she whispered. And for the first time, there was no accusation in the room. Only regret. As the crowd continued to grow, something else became clear. These people, they knew each other. Not all of them, but enough. They exchanged nods, shared small smiles, recognized familiar faces, like threads woven together by a common point. Me, the woman who had been just there, the woman they thought had no one. Now she was the center of a room that could barely contain the people who came to say goodbye. Daniel looked around, his eyes scanning the faces. "So this is where she went," he said quietly. Linda nodded. "Yes," she replied. "This is where she lived." That word again. Lived. Not existed. Not past time. Lived. And as Daniel stood there, surrounded by strangers who knew his mother better than he did, the weight of that realization finally settled in. He hadn't lost someone he understood. He had lost someone he never even tried to know. And now, it was too late to ask her why. The room was no longer quiet enough for denial. Voices filled every corner now, not loud, not chaotic, but steady, persistent, like a truth that refused to be ignored. Daniel stood in the center of it, completely still. Not because nothing was happening, but because too much was. Everywhere he turned, someone was speaking about me. Not to him, about me. As if I had lived an entire life outside of his awareness, and now piece by piece that life was being laid bare in front of him. "I didn't even know she came here," he murmured, almost to himself. Linda heard him. "She came every week," she said gently. "Sometimes every day." Daniel shook his head slowly. "That doesn't make sense. She never said anything." "I didn't even know she came here," he murmured almost to himself. Linda heard him. "She came every week," she said gently. "Sometimes every day." Daniel shook his head slowly. "That doesn't make sense. She never said anything." Linda studied him for a moment. "Did you ever ask?" she replied. The question landed harder than any accusation. Daniel didn't answer. Because he couldn't. Nearby, Chloe was listening to another woman. Angela White, a school teacher, her voice calm but emotional. "She volunteered at our after-school program," Angela said. "We had kids who didn't have anyone to help them. Erica, she made sure they felt seen." Chloe blinked. "My grandma helped kids." Angela smiled softly. "More than you know." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small, worn notebook. "This was hers," Angela said. "She used to write down their names, their progress, things they struggled with." Chloe's breath caught. "She had a notebook like that at home," she whispered. Angela nodded. "She never forgot anyone," she said. "That was her gift." Across the room, Marcus was speaking with another man, a mechanic named Ray, his hands rough, his voice steady. She showed up when my shop was about to close, Ray said. Didn't ask questions, just listened. What did she do? Marcus asked. Ray chuckled softly. She reminded me why I started in the first place, he said. And somehow, that was enough to keep me going. Marcus nodded, understanding completely, because he had his own version of that story, and so did everyone else in that room. Daniel slowly turned in a circle, his eyes moving from one group to another. Each conversation, each story, each piece of a puzzle he had never even known existed. This can't be all of it, he said quietly. James stepped closer. It isn't, he replied. Daniel looked at him. How much did she do? He asked. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the door where more people were still entering. Then he looked back at Daniel. More than you'll ever be able to count, he said. The truth of that statement settled heavily in Daniel's chest, because for the first time, he believed it. Melissa, however, was struggling. Her composure had cracked, but not in the way Daniel's had. Where he was collapsing inward, she was pushing back. This doesn't make sense, she said again, louder this time. If she was doing all of this, why didn't she tell us? The room quieted slightly at her voice. Not completely, but enough for her words to carry. Angela turned toward her, her expression calm. Because she wasn't doing it for you, she said. Melissa blinked. What, she asked? Angela didn't raise her voice. She wasn't doing it for recognition, she clarified. She wasn't doing it to prove anything. She was doing it because people needed her. Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it again, because there was nothing she could say to that. Chloe stepped closer to her mother. Maybe she didn't think we cared, she said softly. The words were quiet, but they cut deep. Melissa looked at her daughter, her expression faltering. That's not true, she said quickly. Chloe didn't argue. She just looked around the room, at the people, at the stories, at the life her grandmother had lived without them. And then she said something that no one was ready to hear. Then why didn't we notice? She asked. Silence. Not the empty silence from before, but a heavy one, a full one, the kind that comes when the truth is standing right in front of you and you have no way around it. Daniel sat down slowly in one of the chairs, his head in his hands. I thought she was lonely, he said. James shook his head gently. She wasn't, he replied. Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with something raw. Then why didn't she ever say anything he asked? Linda stepped forward again. Because some people don't need to talk about what they do, she said. They just do it. Daniel let that sink in, and for the first time, he began to understand something he had missed his entire life. That love doesn't always look the way you expect, that it doesn't always demand attention, that sometimes it exists quietly in the background, shaping lives without ever asking to be seen. Chloe moved to sit beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She wasn't alone, she said softly. Daniel nodded. No, he replied, she wasn't. He looked up again, his gaze sweeping across the room, at the people who had come, at the lives I had touched, at the truth he had never bothered to uncover. And slowly, painfully, a realization began to take shape, not just about who I was, but about who he had been. Because it wasn't just that he didn't know me, it was that he hadn't tried to. And now, There was no way to go back and fix that. No conversation to have. No question to ask. Only answers given too late. As more people continued to share their stories, a pattern became clear. I had been everywhere, in places they had never looked, in lives they had never imagined, quietly, consistently, without recognition. And now, all of it was coming together. Not as a secret, but as a legacy. One that couldn't be ignored, one that couldn't be dismissed, one that demanded to be seen. And as Daniel sat there, surrounded by the truth of who his mother had really been, he realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had never lost me at that funeral. He had lost me long before that. He just hadn't noticed. By the time the funeral director quietly signaled for a pause in the flow of visitors, the room had transformed completely. What had begun as a near-empty gathering had become something else entirely. A testimony, a reckoning. And Daniel was standing at the center of it, barely holding himself together. I need a moment, he said, his voice strained. The funeral director nodded, stepping forward. If anyone would like to share a few words, he announced gently, we can take some time now. There was a brief hesitation, not because no one had anything to say, but because too many did. Then a man in a dark suit stepped forward from the back of the room. He moved differently from the others, calm, deliberate, composed. Professional. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, and as he approached, I recognized him instantly. Robert Klein, the lawyer. Daniel didn't. Not yet. Excuse me, Robert said, his voice clear but respectful. My name is Robert Klein. I represent Erica Hughes. The room shifted again. Melissa straightened immediately. Represent, she repeated. What do you mean? Robert gave her a polite nod. I've worked with Erica for several years, he explained. Daniel frowned. I'm her son. I've never heard of you. Robert met his gaze calmly. That doesn't surprise me, he said. There was no insult in his tone, but the implication was impossible to ignore. I wasn't aware she had legal matters, Daniel added, trying to regain control of the situation. Robert opened his briefcase, slowly removing a folder. She did, he said. Extensive ones. The word hung in the air. Extensive. Melissa glanced at Daniel, unease creeping back into her expression. What kind of matters? She asked. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room. At the people, at the crowd that had gathered. At the undeniable evidence of a life far larger than the one Daniel and Melissa had known. Then he spoke. Erica Hughes was the founder of the Hughes Outreach Initiative, he said. Silence. Confusion. Daniel blinked. The what? Robert continued, his voice steady. A private charitable fund she established nearly 10 years ago, he explained. Its purpose was to provide direct support to individuals in crisis, medical, financial, and emotional. Melissa shook her head. That's not possible. But Robert didn't even look at her. She funded it entirely herself, he added. That landed. Hard. Dan Eel stared at him. With what money? Melissa shook her head. That's not possible. But Robert didn't even look at her. She funded it entirely herself. He added. That landed. Hard. Daniel stared at him. With what money? Robert finally turned his attention back to him. Your father's life insurance, he said. Daniel froze. And the investments she managed afterward? Robert continued. She was quite careful with her finances. Melissa's voice rose slightly. You're saying she had money? Significant money? Robert nodded once. Yes, he said simply. The room felt like it tilted. Because this wasn't just about kindness anymore. This wasn't just about kindness anymore. This wasn't just about quiet acts of generosity. This was something bigger, something deliberate. She chose not to live extravagantly, Robert added, because she preferred to use her resources elsewhere. Isn't just about quiet acts of generosity. This was something bigger, something deliberate. She chose not to live extravagantly, Robert added, because she preferred to use her resources elsewhere. The word echoed through Daniel's mind, not on herself, not on comfort, not even on the family who had assumed she had nothing, but on strangers, on people they had never met. Do you have any proof of this? Melissa asked sharply. Robert didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his folder and pulled out several documents. I do, he said. He handed one to Daniel. Daniel took it slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he looked down. Numbers, large ones, transfers, donations, names, dates, a pattern, a clear, undeniable pattern. This can't be right, Daniel whispered. But it was. Every page confirmed it. Every line told the same story, a story he had never been part of. She paid for surgeries, Linda said softly from behind him. Daniel turned slightly. And rent, Marcus added. And school programs, Angela said. And emergency funds, someone else called out. The voices overlapped now, not chaotic, but unified, each one adding another piece, another truth. Melissa took a step back, her face pale. She never told us, she repeated as if saying it enough times might change the reality. Robert closed his folder gently. She wasn't required to, he said. The statement was simple, but devastating, because it meant one thing. She hadn't hidden it. She had simply chosen not to share it. Daniel lowered the papers slowly. Why? He asked. The question came out broken. Raw. Robert looked at him carefully, because she believed he said that the value of what she did wasn't in being seen, but in making a difference. Daniel swallowed hard. And she did, Robert added. He gestured toward the room. This is the result. Daniel turned, really turned, and for the first time, he didn't see strangers. He saw connections, lives, stories, a network of people bound together by something he had never taken the time to understand. My life. Melissa sank into a chair, her composure completely gone now. I thought she began, then stopped, because whatever she had thought was wrong. Chloe stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Robert. Does that mean she hesitated? Does that mean Grandma built all of this? Robert smiled faintly. Yes, he said. Chloe looked around the room again, her expression shifting from confusion to awe. She wasn't alone at all, she whispered. No, Robert replied. She wasn't. Daniel let out a slow, shaky breath. I told her she should go somewhere else, he said quietly. No one responded, because they all understood what he meant. I thought she had nothing here, he continued, his voice cracked. I thought she needed us. James stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. She didn't need you the way you think, he said gently. Daniel looked at him. But she still loved you, James added. That hit the hardest, because it was true, despite everything. Despite being unseen. Despite being dismissed. Despite being forgotten. I had loved them. And now they were left with that truth, with everything they hadn't said, everything they hadn't asked, everything they had assumed. As the room settled again, one thing became undeniable. This wasn't just a funeral anymore. It was a revelation, a complete, irreversible exposure of the truth. And Daniel was only beginning to understand the depth of what he had lost. The room didn't empty. Even after the first wave of stories, even after the revelations, even after the quiet shock had settled into something heavier, people stayed, not out of obligation, out of connection. That alone said more than anything Daniel could process. He stood near the casket now, no longer at a distance, no longer observing from the outside. He stood like someone trying to catch up to a life he had missed. "I don't understand," he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just into the space. "I was there," he continued. "I lived with her. How did I not see any of this?" No one rushed to answer. Because some questions don't need answers. They need acceptance. Chloe stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "Because we weren't looking," she said. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That was it. Simple, painful, true. Across the room, Melissa remained seated, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken in several minutes. Not since the lawyer, not since the money, not since the realization that Erica had not been dependent but independent in a way she had never imagined. Her silence wasn't reflection. It was resistance. "I still don't understand why she didn't tell us," she said finally, her voice controlled but strained. Robert turned slightly toward her. "She wrote a letter," he said. The words cut through the room instantly. Daniel looked up. "A letter," Robert nodded. "Yes," he said. "It was left with her will, intended specifically for you." Daniel's breath caught. "For me?" he asked. Robert reached into his briefcase again, pulling out a sealed envelope. Daniel stared at it like it might disappear if he blinked. "What does it say?" he asked. Robert held it out. "That's for you to read," he replied. Daniel hesitated before taking it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as if everything he had never asked, everything he had never seen, was somehow contained inside. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned it over. His name was written on the front. Not printed, not typed. Written. My handwriting. Chloe stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "Are you going to read it?" she asked softly. Daniel swallowed. I don't know if I can," he admitted. James spoke gently from behind him. "You should," he said. Daniel nodded slowly, because he knew. Whatever was inside that letter, it was the last chance he had to hear my voice. He opened it carefully, unfolded the paper, and began to read. The room fell silent, not forced, not requested. It just because he knew. Whatever was inside that letter, it was the last chance he had to hear my voice. He opened it carefully, unfolded the paper, and began to read. The room fell silent, not forced, not requested. It just happened, because everyone understood. This wasn't just a letter, it was closure. Daniel's voice shook at first, then steadied as he continued. Daniel, he read. He paused, closed his eyes for a second, then went on. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to say these things to you in person. Chloe's hand found his arm again. I want you to know something first before anything else. I never blamed you. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to say these things to you in person. Chloe's hand found his arm again. I want you to know something first before anything else. I never blamed you. Daniel's breath hitched. Melissa looked up sharply. Life has a way of making people busy, distracted, focused on what's right in front of them. I understand that. Anything else? I never blamed you. Daniel's breath hitched. Melissa looked up sharply. Life has a way of making people busy, distracted, focused on what's right in front of them. I understand that. Daniel's voice grew quieter. I saw the man you became. And even when you didn't see me, I still saw you. A tear slipped down his cheek. Unnoticed, unstoppable. I didn't tell you about what I was doing because I didn't want you to feel obligated to understand it. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. Some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be lived. Daniel stopped for a moment, pressing his lips together, then continued. But I hope one day you'll look beyond what you thought you knew about me and see what was really there. His voice cracked, because that day had come. Too late. And if you do, I hope you don't feel guilt. Daniel shook his head slightly. Impossible. I hope you feel pride. That word lingered in the air. Pride, not anger, not disappointment, not regret. Pride. Because everything I did with love. Not just for others, but for you too. Chloe began to cry quietly. Melissa looked away again. Take care of Chloe. Remind her to see people fully, even when it's not easy. Chloe squeezed Daniel's arm tighter. And Daniel, if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. Daniel paused, his hands shaking now. People are more than what you see at home. The room held its breath. Don't wait until it's too late to learn who they really are. Silence. Deep. Complete. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. His hands fell to his sides, and for a long moment he said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be said had already been written. Melissa shifted in her seat, her voice quieter now. She wasn't angry, she asked. Robert shook his head gently. No, he said. She wasn't. Had already been written. Melissa shifted in her seat, her voice quieter now. She wasn't angry, she asked. Robert shook his head gently. No, he said. She wasn't. That realization hit harder than anything else. Because anger would have been easier to face, easier to respond to. But love given without expectation, without recognition, that was something else entirely. Daniel wiped his face slowly, not even trying to hide the tears anymore. I didn't deserve that, he said. James stepped closer again. That's the thing about people like her, he said softly. They don't give based on what you deserve. Daniel looked at him. They give because that's who they are. Daniel nodded slowly, and for the first time he truly understood. Not just what I had done, but who I had been, and why he had never seen it. Because he had never looked beyond what was easy, never asked the questions that mattered, never taken the time to understand the quiet parts of my life. And now all he had left was the truth. and the weight of realizing it too late. After the letter, the room didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't. Something fundamental had shifted. Not just in what people knew, but in how they felt. There was no longer confusion, no longer doubt, only truth. And now, something else was about to follow. Robert stepped forward again, his presence calm but deliberate.
"There is one more matter to address,"
he said. Daniel looked up slowly, his eyes still red, his expression worn down by everything he had just taken in.
"What else is there?"
he asked quietly. Robert held his gaze.
"Erica's will," he said.
The word changed the air instantly. Melissa straightened in her chair, her posture tightening again. Because this was something she understood. Money, assets, ownership, control. Of course, she said quickly. We should take care of that. Her tone was different now, not shaken, focused, calculated. Daniel didn't react the same way. He barely moved, but he didn't stop Robert either. Please, Daniel said softly.
"Go ahead."
Robert nodded once and opened his folder again.
"This document was finalized 3 months ago,"
he began. It outlines the distribution of Erica Hughes' estate, including financial assets, properties, and ongoing charitable commitments. Melissa leaned forward slightly. Properties, she repeated. Robert continued without acknowledging her interruption. As previously established, Erica maintained a private charitable fund, the Hughes Outreach Initiative, he said. The majority of her financial assets are allocated to that fund. Melissa froze. What? She said sharply. Daniel blinked. The majority? Robert nodded.
"Yes,"
he said. Melissa shook her head immediately. That doesn't make sense, she said. She lived with us. We took care of her. That money should... Melissa Daniel interrupted quietly, but she didn't stop. That money should stay in the family, she insisted. That's how these things work. Robert looked at her calmly. That is not how Erica chose to structure her estate, he said. The words were polite, but final. Melissa stared at him. So what are you saying? She demanded. That we get nothing. Robert turned a page. No, he said. You are included. Melissa exhaled sharply, relief flashing across her face. But it didn't last long. A portion of the estate has been designated for Daniel Hughes, Robert continued. Primarily the residence. Daniel looked up, surprised. The house, he asked. Robert nodded. Yes, he said. The home remains yours. Melissa nodded quickly. Of course, she said. That's only fair. But Robert wasn't finished. The remaining liquid assets, he continued, are directed towards sustaining and expanding the Hughes Outreach Initiative. Melissa's expression hardened again. How much is remaining? She asked. Robert met her gaze. Approximately 85% of the total estate, he said. Silence. Complete, unforgiving. Melissa blinked slowly. 85%, she repeated. Yes, Robert said. Her voice rose. That's ridiculous, she snapped. That she can't just give everything away like that. Robert didn't react. She can, he said. And she did. Daniel lowered his head slightly. Not in defeat, in understanding. Because this made sense. Of course it did. Everything he had seen today pointed to this. This wasn't a last-minute decision. This was who I had been all along. Melissa, however, wasn't ready to accept it. This isn't right, she said. We're her family. Robert nodded. Yes, he said. You are. Then how could she leave us with so little? Melissa pressed. Robert closed the folder gently, because she believed he said that what she had already given you was enough. Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but stopped, because for the first time, she didn't know what to say. Chloe stepped forward slowly, her voice quiet. "What else did she leave?" she asked. Robert's expression softened slightly. "There is a personal provision for you," he said. Chloe blinked. "For me?" Robert nodded. "Yes," he said. "A trust set aside for your education and for anything you may need to build your future." Chloe's eyes filled again. She thought of everything she whispered. Daniel looked at her, then back at Robert. "She always did," he said. The realization settled deeper now. Not just that I had lived a life they didn't know, but that I had planned for a future they had taken for granted. Melissa sat back in her chair, her energy draining. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured again. But this time, it sounded different, less like resistance, more like loss, because she wasn't just losing money. She was losing the narrative she had built, the one where I was dependent, small, irrelevant. That version of me no longer existed. And there was nothing she could do to bring it back. Daniel stood slowly, the letter still in his hand. "She didn't owe us that money," he said. Melissa looked up sharply. "What?" she asked. Daniel met her eyes. "She didn't owe us anything," he repeated. The words were calm, but firm. Melissa stared at him, searching for something. Agreement, support, validation. She found none. "Daniel," she began. "No," he said quietly. He looked around the room again, at the people, at the stories, at the truth that had been laid out piece by piece. "She gave her life to something bigger than us," he said. Melissa shook her head. "But we're her family," she insisted. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said. "We were." The distinction hung in the air, past tense, and for the first time, Melissa understood what that meant. Not that she had lost a mother-in-law, but that she had never truly had one. Not in the way she thought. Chloe stepped closer to the casket again, her hand resting gently on it. "I think she wanted us to see this," she said. Daniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" Chloe took a breath. "All of this," she said, gesturing to the room. "The people, the stories, the truth." She paused. "Maybe that's why she didn't tell us," she added, "because she knew we wouldn't understand it until now." Daniel nodded slowly. "Because that felt right. Not punishment, not revenge, just revelation. The kind that comes when there's no more time to ignore it." And as the room settled once more, as the weight of everything continued to sink in, one thing became clear. This wasn't the end of Erica Hughes' story. It was the moment her family finally began to understand it. The room didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt exposed, like everything that had been hidden for years was now laid out in the open, impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. And for Daniel, that truth wasn't just something he saw. It was something he felt. Everywhere. In his chest. In his hands. In the way his breath came uneven, like he was still trying to catch up to something that had already passed him by. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. No one rushed to answer, because there was no easy answer, no simple solution. Some things can't be fixed. They can only be faced. Chloe sat beside him, her hand still resting gently on his arm. "Maybe you don't fix it," she said softly. Daniel looked at her. "Then what do I do?" he asked. Chloe hesitated, searching for the right words. Maybe you learn from it, she said. The simplicity of her answer hit harder than anything else had that day. Learn from it, not undo it, not erase it, just carry it forward. Daniel nodded slowly, because for the first time, that felt possible. Across the room, Melissa stood up again, but she didn't step forward. She lingered at the edge of everything, watching, listening, trying to process a reality that no longer aligned with the one she had built. I thought I understood her, she said suddenly. Her voice wasn't defensive anymore. It was quiet, uncertain. I thought she was dependent, that she needed us, that we were doing her a favor. No one interrupted her, because they all knew this was her moment of truth. I thought she didn't have a life outside that house, she continued. Her eyes moved toward the crowd, the people, the evidence. I thought wrong, she admitted. The words came slowly, but they came. Daniel looked at her, not with anger, not with blame, but with something deeper. Recognition. Yeah, he said quietly. We both did. Melissa swallowed hard. I don't know how I missed all of this, she said. Linda stepped closer, her voice gentle. Because you weren't part of it, she replied. Melissa flinched slightly at the honesty, but she didn't argue, because she knew it was true. She hadn't been part of that world. She hadn't tried to be. And now, she was standing on the outside of something that had always existed without her. Chloe stood up slowly, her gaze still fixed on the casket. She wasn't invisible, she said. The statement hung in the air. Simple. Clear. She was just invisible to us. Daniel closed his eyes. Because that was the truth. Not that I had been alone, but that they had chosen not to see me. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but still completely. I used to think she didn't do anything, Daniel said, his voice low. He let out a small, broken laugh. I thought she just went out for no reason, that she was wasting time. But still completely. I used to think she didn't do anything, Daniel said, his voice low. He let out a small, broken laugh. I thought she just went out for no reason, that she was wasting time. He shook his head. She was saving people, he said. James nodded. Yes, he replied. She was. Daniel looked around the room again. At the faces, at the lives, at the impact. And I didn't even know, he added. The weight of that realization settled deeper now, not as shock, but as regret, the kind that doesn't fade quickly, the kind that stays. Chloe turned to him. But you know now, she said. Daniel met her eyes. Yeah, he said. I do. There was a pause. Then Chloe asked the question that had been quietly forming all along. So, what are we going to do about it? Daniel didn't answer right away. Because this wasn't about words anymore. It was about action, real action. The kind that proves understanding. He looked toward Robert. The foundation, he said. Is it still active? Robert nodded. Yes, he replied. Very much so. There are ongoing cases, people who still rely on it. Daniel nodded slowly. Then it continues, he said. Melissa looked at him surprised. What do you mean, she asked. Daniel turned to her. I mean, we don't touch it, he said. We don't fight it. We don't try to change what she built. Melissa hesitated. But that's most of the money, she said. Daniel nodded. I know, he replied. And you're okay with that? She asked. Daniel took a breath. then answered with something that surprised even himself. "I'm not okay with what I did," he said. The honesty of it silenced everything around him. "But I can be okay with what she chose," he added. Melissa stared at him, because this wasn't the response she expected. Not from him, not from anyone. Daniel looked back at the casket, at me, and for the first time there was no distance in his gaze, no misunderstanding, no assumption, just recognition. "I can't go back," he said quietly. "No," James replied. "You can't. But I can go forward," Daniel continued. James nodded. "Yes," he said, "you can." Chloe stepped closer again, her voice filled with something new. Not sadness, not confusion, hope. "Then we keep it going," she said. Daniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" Chloe smiled, faintly, tears still in her eyes. "We don't just leave it as something she did," she said. "We make it something we do." The idea settled in the room, not as pressure, but as possibility. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "we do." Melissa didn't speak, but she didn't argue either, because something inside her had shifted too. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough to see that this wasn't about losing something. It was about understanding something, something bigger than herself. As the room slowly began to quiet again, as people continued to come and go, each one leaving behind a piece of a story that would never be forgotten, one truth remained. Erica Hughes had never been alone. She had never been forgotten. She had never been just there. She had been everything they never took the time to see. And now, it was their turn to decide what to do with that truth. The funeral didn't end the way most do. There was no quick dispersal, no quiet exit into parking lots filled with polite goodbyes and forgotten names. People stayed, not because they had to, but because something had begun. A continuation, a quiet, unspoken decision that what Erica Hughes had built would not end with her. I watched it unfold the only way I could, now silently from the edge of everything. Daniel stood near the front long after the official service had concluded, not greeting people out of obligation anymore, but listening, really listening. A woman approached him, her hands trembling slightly as she held a photograph. "This is my son," she said. Daniel took the photo carefully. A young boy smiling his arm around someone just outside the frame. "Your mother helped him," she continued. "He was struggling in school. She sat with him every week, tutored him, encouraged him." Daniel nodded slowly. "He graduated last month," she added. Her voice broke. "He wanted to come today, but he couldn't. He's away at college." Daniel swallowed hard. "She would have been proud," he said. The woman smiled through her tears. "I think she knew," she replied, and that changed something. Because Daniel realized this wasn't about what he had missed anymore. It was about what still existed, all around him. Chloe was moving through the room too, but in a different way. She wasn't just listening. She was asking questions. "What did she do for you?" she asked one man. "How did you meet her?" she asked another. "What was she like outside of here?" she asked a third. And every answer built something inside her. Not confusion, not regret, understanding. She was piecing together a version of me that she had only glimpsed before. And unlike Daniel, she still had time to carry that forward. Melissa stood off to the side again. But this time, she wasn't distant. She was observing, quietly, carefully. A woman approached her, someone Melissa didn't recognize.
She helped me when I had nothing," the woman said simply. Melissa nodded. "I'm starting to understand that," she replied. The woman studied her for a moment, then said something unexpected. "You don't have to understand everything she did," she said. "You just have to respect it." Melissa blinked. The words weren't harsh, but they were direct, and for the first time, she didn't resist them. "I do," she said quietly. The woman nodded, then walked away. Melissa stood there letting that settle. Because respect, that was something she could choose now, even if she hadn't before. Near the front, Robert was speaking with Daniel again. "There are ongoing cases," he said. "People who rely on the foundation regularly." Daniel nodded. "I want to see everything," he said. "Every file, every case, every name." Robert raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's a significant commitment," he said. "I know," Daniel replied. Robert studied him carefully. "And you're prepared for that?" he asked. Daniel didn't hesitate this time. "Yes," he said, not because he felt ready, but because he understood that readiness wasn't the point. Responsibility was. Chloe stepped closer. "I want to help too," she said. Daniel looked at her. "You don't have to," he said. Chloe shook her head. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." There was no pressure in her voice, no guilt, just intention. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said. Melissa approached them carefully. Not confidently, not like before, but honestly. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked. Daniel turned to her. "It means we don't walk away from this," he said. Melissa glanced around the room again, at the people still lingering, at the lives still connected. "And we're part of it?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "If we choose to be," he said. Melissa hesitated, because this wasn't her world. Not yet. But she understood something now that she hadn't before. This wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about convenience. It wasn't even about family in the way she had always defined it. It was about impact, real impact, and whether she wanted to be part of something that mattered. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Neither do I," he said. Chloe smiled faintly. "But she did," she added. The three of them stood there for a moment, not as they had been before, not disconnected, not distant, but uncertain, together. And that was enough to begin. Across the room, the final visitors began to leave. Not quickly, not without pause. Each one taking a moment at the casket. Each one leaving something behind: flowers, notes, quiet words that didn't need to be heard aloud. And slowly, the room began to empty. But this time, it didn't feel empty. Because something remained. Not just memories, not just regret, but purpose. Daniel was the last to step away. He stood in front of the casket for a long moment, his hand resting lightly on its surface. "I didn't know you," he said quietly. No one else was close enough to hear. "And that's on me." He took a breath. "But I'm going to learn," he added. His voice steadied. "I'm going to learn everything I should have asked you." There was no answer, not the kind he expected. But something in the room shifted anyway. Like a quiet acknowledgement. Like a beginning. Chloe stepped beside him. "She already knows," she said softly. Daniel looked at her. "You think so?" But something in the room shifted anyway. Like a quiet acknowledgement. Like a beginning. Chloe stepped beside him. She already knows, she said softly. Daniel looked at her. You think so? He asked. Chloe nodded. Yeah, she said. I think she always did. Daniel smiled faintly. Not because the pain was gone, but because something else had taken its place. Clarity. And as they turned to leave together. One thing became certain. Erica Hughes' story hadn't ended. It had just changed hands. 1 year later, the house felt different. Not bigger, not quieter, just more honest. The guest bedroom at the end of the hallway was no longer called the spare room. It was Erica's room now. Daniel had insisted on that. He hadn't changed much inside it. The bed was the same. The old beige coat still hung behind the door. The worn leather bag sat neatly on the desk, untouched, except for the one thing he had added beside it, the notebook. He had found it the day after the funeral, carefully placed in a drawer he had never thought to open before. Names. Dozens at first glance. Then, hundreds. Each one written in the same steady handwriting. Each one a person he had never known existed in his mother's life. He didn't just look at it anymore. He used it. Because the foundation, Erica Hughes Foundation, now renamed by Chloe, had grown. Not dramatically, not publicly, but steadily, the way it always had. Daniel sat at the kitchen table flipping through a folder filled with case notes. He no longer rushed through things. He read, carefully, thoroughly, the way he imagined I would have. Chloe sat across from him, laptop open, her fingers moving quickly as she updated records. Marcus sent an email, she said. He wants to volunteer more regularly. He's bringing 2 colleagues from his company. Daniel nodded. Good, he said. We need more people like him. Chloe smiled slightly. He said he owes you, she added. Daniel shook his head. No, he said quietly. He owes her. Chloe didn't argue, because they both knew that was true. Melissa stood by the counter watching them. Not from a distance anymore. Not removed, just observing. She had changed too. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, deliberate ways. She no longer referred to the foundation as that thing. She didn't question where the money was going, and sometimes she showed up, like she did last week when she spent an entire afternoon helping organize supplies for a shelter. She hadn't talked about it afterward. She hadn't needed to. Now she walked over slowly, placing a cup of coffee beside Daniel. You've been working on that for hours, she said. Daniel looked up. Yeah, he replied. There's a lot to go through. Melissa nodded. I can help, she said. It wasn't forced. It wasn't hesitant. It was simple. Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay, he said. And just like that, they began. Together. Not perfectly, not seamlessly, but honestly. Chloe watched them both, a quiet sense of something settling inside her. Not relief, not closure, something deeper. Continuity. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove downtown. It had become part of his routine now. The same route, the same stops, places he had passed 1,000 times without ever knowing why they mattered. The community center was still there. Faded paint, creaky floors. But inside, it was alive, just like before. Mrs. Patterson sat in her usual chair by the window. When she saw Daniel walk in, she smiled. Well, she said, you're not her, but you'll do. Daniel smiled faintly. I get that a lot, he replied. He walked over, sitting in the chair beside her. She used to sit right there, Mrs. Patterson said, pointing. Daniel nodded. I know, he said. He had learned that now. Learned her routines, her places, her quiet patterns that had once gone unnoticed. She talked about you sometimes, Mrs. Patterson added.
Daniel looked at her surprised. She did? He asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded. Always said you were a good man, she said. Daniel swallowed. Because that still didn't feel true. But he was trying. I hope I can live up to that, he said. Mrs. Patterson patted his hand. Just keep showing up, she replied. That's what she did. Simple. Clear. Enough. Later, Daniel walked to the hospital. The same halls, the same quiet urgency. Linda spotted him immediately. You're here again, she said with a smile. Yeah, he replied. He didn't say why anymore. He didn't need to. She understood. Room 312, she said. He's been asking for someone. Daniel nodded. I'll go, he said. As he walked toward the room, he felt something familiar. Not the weight he had carried after the funeral. Not the regret that had defined those first weeks. Something else. Purpose. He knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. A man lay in the bed, his eyes tired, his expression distant. Daniel pulled up a chair. Hey. Something else. Purpose. He knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. A man lay in the bed, his eyes tired, his expression distant. Daniel pulled up a chair. Hey, he said. The man looked at him. Do I know you? He asked. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. He paused, then added the words he had learned to say. But I'm here. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. Okay, he said, and that was enough. That was always enough. Back at the house that evening, Chloe sat in Erica's room, flipping through the notebook again. She traced her fingers over the names. So many lives, so many stories, so much quiet impact. She really did all of this, she whispered. And in a way, I was still there. Not in the room, not in the house, but in everything they were doing now. In every decision. In every moment they chose to see someone instead of overlook them. In every life they touched even just a little. Daniel stood in the doorway watching Chloe. She did, he said. Chloe looked up. Do you think we'll ever be like her? She asked. Daniel thought about it, about everything he had learned, everything he had missed, everything he was still trying to understand. Then he shook his head gently. No, he said. Chloe frowned slightly. No, she repeated. Daniel stepped into the room, his gaze soft. We won't be like her, he said, but we can carry what she started. Chloe nodded slowly. And for her, that was enough. As the night settled over the house, something quiet filled the space. Not silence, not emptiness, but presence. The kind that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. Because Erica Hughes had never been invisible. She had never been alone. She had simply been extraordinary in ways no one had taken the time to notice. Until it was too late. And yet, not too late to learn. Not too late to change. Not too late to continue. And maybe that was the legacy that mattered most. What Erica Hughes' story reminds us is something many of us quietly forget as life gets busy. People are never as small as they seem when we stop paying attention to them. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room is carrying the heaviest impact in the world. Sometimes, the one we overlook at home is someone others are depending on just to get through the day. We live in a time where we measure value by visibility, by success, by noise, by recognition.
But Erica's life teaches us that true value often lives in silence. It lives in the unseen moments, a hand held in a hospital room, a word of encouragement at the right time, a sacrifice no one ever hears about. These are the things that don't make headlines, but they change lives forever. And maybe the hardest lesson of all is this: we don't lose people only when they're gone. Sometimes we lose them long before that, when we stop asking, stop noticing, stop caring enough to truly see them. Regret doesn't come from what we didn't have. It comes from what we had and didn't recognize in time. But there is hope in this story too. Because awareness is a second chance. You may not be able to go back and fix every missed moment, but you can choose to see people differently from today forward. You can choose to ask one more question, to listen a little longer, to look beyond what's obvious. You can choose to become the kind of person who makes quiet differences in someone else's life. And maybe, just maybe, that's how legacies continue. If this story touched you, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever realized too late how important someone was in your life? Or have you ever experienced a quiet act of kindness that changed everything for you? Leave a comment and share your story. I read every single one, and if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing more meaningful journeys together.